Every night at 10:03 p.m., the phone rings. I know it's him before I even look at the screen. Marcus, my son, the child I carried for 9 months, the boy I rocked to sleep, the young man I sacrificed everything for. But now, when I hear his voice, my chest tightens with a fear I can't quite name. "Are you alone, Mom?" That's all he ever asks. Never, "How are you?" Never, "I miss you." Just those 4 words that make my blood run cold. Tonight, like every night, I sit in my empty kitchen, staring at the phone as it buzzes against the wooden table my late husband built with his own hands 40 years ago. The same table where Marcus used to do his homework, where we celebrated his birthdays, where I helped him practice for job interviews that he promised would change our lives. The fluorescent light above flickers. It's been doing that for months, but I can't afford to fix it. Everything in this house is breaking down, piece by piece, just like the family that used to fill these rooms with laughter. The wallpaper is peeling near the sink, showing patches of the green paint underneath that Robert chose when we first moved in. Back then, we thought this house would see grandchildren running through its hallways. We thought love was enough to keep a family together. I was wrong. "Are you alone, Mom?" His voice cuts through my memories like a knife. There's something in his tone that wasn't there before. Something darker, more urgent. It's been 6 months since he moved out, taking with him not just his belongings, but thousands of dollars from the savings account we kept for emergencies. The account that had my husband's life insurance money. The account that was supposed to keep me safe in my old age. But I never reported him. How could I? He's my son. I look around my kitchen, taking in the silence that has become my constant companion. The refrigerator hums its lonely song, and I can hear Mrs. Patterson's television through the thin walls. She's watching one of those old movies where families stay together and mothers are respected by their children. I used to watch those movies too, believing that's how real life worked. The truth is, I am alone. More alone than I've ever been in my 73 years on this earth. My husband Robert passed 5 years ago, and with him went the last person who truly loved me unconditionally. My daughter Sarah lives 3 states away with her own family, too busy with her successful career to call more than once a month. And Marcus became a stranger wearing my son's face. "Yes, honey, I'm alone," I whisper into the phone, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. It's always the truth. It's been the truth for longer than I care to admit. I hear him exhale on the other end, and then the line goes dead. No goodbye. No, "I love you, Mom." Just dial tone, leaving me sitting in my kitchen with only the sound of my own heartbeat for company. This wasn't how I imagined my golden years would be. When Robert and I bought this house, when we painted the nursery yellow because we wanted to be surprised, when we planted the oak tree in the backyard that now towers over our neighbor's fence, we talked about growing old surrounded by children and grandchildren. We pictured Sunday dinners with a full table, holiday mornings with presents scattered under a tree, summers with little voices calling Grandma, Grandpa from the garden. Instead, I eat dinner alone every night, the same simple meals that stretch my Social Security check as far as it will go. Instead, I spend holidays watching other families on television, wondering what I did wrong, where I failed as a mother. Instead, I lie awake at night, jumping at every sound, because something in Marcus's voice tells me that these phone calls aren't just about checking on me. If you like stories that touch the heart, please subscribe to our channel. We're trying to reach 1,000 subscribers, and it really helps our work. And comment which city you're watching from. They say a mother's love is unconditional, and maybe that's true. But what they don't tell you is that sometimes that love becomes a prison. Sometimes caring for your child means enabling their worst impulses. Sometimes protecting them means destroying yourself. I still remember the day everything changed. It was a Tuesday morning in March, and I was making coffee in this same kitchen when Marcus walked in with that look in his eyes. The same look he'd had as a child when he'd broken something valuable and was trying to decide whether to confess or lie. But he wasn't a child anymore. He was 35 years old, unemployed for the 3rd time in 2 years, and I could smell alcohol on his breath even though it wasn't even 9 in the morning. "Mom, I need money," he said, not even bothering with pleasantries. "Just a loan. I'll pay you back." I'd heard those words so many times before. The grocery money I'd given him when his electricity got shut off. The rent money I'd provided when he was facing eviction. The car payment I'd covered when his transmission died. Thousands of dollars over the years, disappearing into the black hole of his irresponsibility, never to be seen again. But this time was different. This time, he wasn't asking. "I know Dad's life insurance money is still in that account," he said, his voice cold and calculating. "You don't need all of it. You've got this house. You've got Social Security. I'm your son. That money should be helping me too." The way he said it, as if my financial security was somehow selfish, as if the money Robert worked his entire life to leave me was just sitting there waiting for Marcus to claim it, made something inside me break. But not in the way you might think. I didn't get angry. I didn't throw him out. I didn't call the police when he took the checkbook from my purse and wrote himself a check for $8,000 while I sat frozen at this very table. I just watched. I watched my son steal from me, and I said nothing, because somewhere in my damaged heart, I still believed that maybe, just maybe, this would be the thing that finally turned his life around. But tonight, 6 months later, as I sit in the same spot where I watched him take everything I had left of my husband's love and protection, I know better. The phone calls aren't about concern. They're about something else entirely, something that makes my hands shake and my throat close up with a fear I've never experienced before. Because tonight, for the first time in 6 months, I heard something new in his voice. Tonight, I heard hunger. The calls started getting stranger after that first theft. Not just the timing, always 10:03 p.m. like he was following some twisted schedule, but the way Marcus spoke to me. Gone was any pretense of the loving son I once knew. In its place was someone who spoke to me like I was an inconvenience, a problem to be managed rather than a mother to be cherished. "Are you alone, Mom?" The question became a ritual, but I started to notice other things. Background noise that didn't make sense, whispered conversations. Sometimes I could swear I heard him talking to someone else before he hung up, discussing things I couldn't quite make out. Plans, maybe. Arrangements. 3 weeks after the first call, he showed up at my door unannounced. It was a Sunday afternoon, and I was tending to my small herb garden, the only thing Robert left me that Marcus couldn't steal with a checkbook. Basil, rosemary, thyme. Simple plants that asked for nothing but water and sunlight, that gave back without expecting anything in return. Unlike my son. "Hey, Mom," he said, leaning against my doorframe like he still lived here, like he hadn't disappeared with $8,000 in 6 months of silence. "Just checking on you." But his eyes weren't checking on me. They were scanning my living room, taking inventory, looking at the antique clock Robert's mother gave us for our wedding, the one that still chimes every hour, marking time I spend alone. Studying the china cabinet with the good dishes we only used for special occasions that stopped coming when the children grew up and moved away. Calculating. Always calculating. "The house looks good," he said, but the way he said it made my skin crawl, like he was appraising it, like he was already planning its future without me in it. I offered him coffee, the way mothers do, the way I was trained to do by my own mother, who believed that feeding people was the highest form of love. But Marcus wasn't hungry for coffee or conversation. He walked through my home like a real estate agent, touching things that didn't belong to him, opening drawers that held my private memories. "You know, Mom, this place is getting too big for you," he said, running his finger along the mantelpiece where pictures of our family used to sit before I took them down, because seeing his face in happier times hurt too much. "A woman your age shouldn't be rattling around in a 4-bedroom house. It's not safe." Safe. The word hit me like a physical blow. This house was the safest place I'd ever known. Within these walls, Robert and I built a life. We weathered storms, literal and metaphorical. We raised 2 children, buried 2 parents, celebrated anniversaries and mourned losses. Every corner held a memory. Every room held love. But Marcus was right about one thing. It wasn't safe anymore. Not because of my age or my ability to maintain it, but because he knew where I lived. Because he had a key that I'd never asked him to return. Because somewhere in his twisted mind, he was already making plans for my future that didn't include my consent. "I'm fine here," I told him, but my voice sounded weak even to me. "This is my home." He smiled then, but it wasn't the smile I remembered from his childhood. It was cold, practiced, the smile of someone who'd learned to manipulate emotions for personal gain. "Of course it is, Mom. I'm just saying. Maybe it's time to think about your options. You know, before you have to. Before I have to." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Before something happens. Before someone makes the decision for me. Before I become even more powerless than I already am. After he left that day, I found things moved. small things that no one else would notice. But when you live alone, you know where everything belongs. The spare key to the shed was missing from the kitchen drawer. The folder with my important documents had been rifled through, papers put back in the wrong order. My medication bottles had been examined. I could tell because Marcus had never learned to be careful with details the way his father was. That night, when the phone rang at 10:03, I almost didn't answer. "Are you alone, Mom?" This time I hesitated, because I realized that being alone wasn't just about having no one in the house with me. It was about having no one who cared about my well-being, no one who would notice if something happened to me, no one who would question Marcus if I suddenly decided to move somewhere smaller, or if I had an accident that required hospitalization, or if I simply disappeared. "Yes," I whispered, but for the first time, the word felt like a surrender. The next few weeks brought more visits, never scheduled, never welcome, but always with the same pattern. Marcus would appear at my door with that fake, concerned expression, walk through my house like he was conducting an inspection, and make increasingly bold suggestions about my future. "You know, there are some really nice assisted living places around here," he said during one visit, picking up my wedding photo and setting it down in the wrong spot. "Places where you wouldn't have to worry about maintenance or cooking or being alone all the time." "I don't want to live in a nursing home," I said firmly, but he waved away my objection like it was irrelevant. "It's not a nursing home, Mom. It's independent living. You'd have your own apartment, but with help when you need it. And think about how much money you'd save not having to maintain this big old house." Money. It always came back to money with Marcus. Not my comfort, not my happiness, not my right to choose where I spent my final years. Just money, and how much of it would be left for him when I was gone. The worst part wasn't his greed. I'd come to expect that. The worst part was how he'd learned to weaponize my love for him. He'd show up when I was feeling particularly lonely, bringing flowers from the grocery store and talking about old times until my defenses came down. Then, just when I'd start to remember the little boy who used to help me bake cookies and read stories with me before bed, he'd pivot to business. "I found this great realtor," he'd say, pulling out brochures like he just happened to have them with him. "She says the market is really hot right now. You could probably get twice what Dad paid for this place." Or, "I was talking to a friend who works at that assisted living place I mentioned. They have a waiting list, but she says she could get you moved to the top if we act fast." Or, "You know, Mom, if something happened to you here alone, no one would know for days. Remember Mrs. Chen down the street? They didn't find her for a week." Each conversation chipped away at my confidence, my sense of security, my belief that I had any control over my own life. He was patient, methodical, wearing me down the way water wears down stone. Some days I found myself actually considering his suggestions, wondering if maybe he was right. Maybe I was being stubborn and selfish by wanting to stay in my own home. But then I'd remember Robert's hands building the kitchen table, or I'd smell the rosemary from my garden, or I'd watch the sunrise through the bedroom window where I'd spent 45 years of mornings. And I'd know that this house wasn't just where I lived, it was who I was. The phone calls continued every night, but they started lasting longer. Marcus would ask about my day, my health, my finances. Always casual, always caring on the surface, but I could feel him gathering information like a lawyer preparing a case. "How are you feeling, Mom? You sound tired. Are you remembering to take your medications? When was the last time you had your blood pressure checked? Are you eating enough? You sound weak." Each question was a fishing expedition, looking for evidence that I was declining, that I needed help, that I couldn't take care of myself anymore. And the terrible truth was, his constant pressure was making those things true. I was tired from worrying about his visits. I was forgetting things because my mind was consumed with fear. I wasn't eating well because my appetite disappeared under the weight of his manipulation. Marcus was slowly, systematically destroying my peace of mind, and then using my distress as evidence that he was right about my inability to live independently. It was brilliant in its cruelty, and I was ashamed to admit that for a while it was working. The day I realized I had become invisible in my own life was the day Marcus brought his girlfriend to my house without asking. Her name was Crystal, and she walked through my home like she was already planning the renovations. 20-something blonde, with the kind of confidence that comes from never having to struggle for anything important. "Oh my God, Marcus, this place has so much potential," she said, running her manicured fingers along my kitchen counters. The same counters where I'd kneaded bread for 40 years, where I'd helped my children with homework, where I'd held Robert's hand during his final illness. With some updating, this could be worth serious money. They talked about me like I wasn't standing right there, like I was a piece of furniture they were considering whether to keep or donate to charity. The kitchen definitely needs gutting, Crystal continued, opening my cabinets without permission, examining my dishes like they were artifacts in a museum. And these carpets have to go. Hardwood underneath probably, which is good. The bathrooms are totally outdated, but that's fixable. Marcus nodded along, taking notes on his phone. Actually taking notes about renovating my home while I stood in my own kitchen, watching strangers plan my future without my input. "Mom, you remember Crystal," he said, as if that made this invasion acceptable. "I told you about her." He hadn't. This was the first time I'd ever seen her, but I didn't correct him because I'd learned that contradicting Marcus only led to lectures about my failing memory. Everything was my failing memory now. If I disagreed with him, I was confused. If I stood up for myself, I was being difficult. If I asked questions, I was being paranoid. "Mrs. Morrison, Marcus tells me you're thinking about downsizing," Crystal said with a smile that never reached her eyes. "That's so smart. My grandmother waited too long to make that decision, and it became really hard on the whole family. I wanted to tell her that I wasn't her grandmother, that I wasn't thinking about downsizing, that this was my home and I would leave when I was ready. But the words stuck in my throat because I could see Marcus watching me, waiting for me to say something he could use as evidence of my deteriorating condition. Instead, I offered them coffee, because that's what you do when you're a mother, even when your son is betraying you, even when strangers are standing in your kitchen planning to steal your life. "Oh, we can't stay long," Crystal said, already heading toward the living room. "We just wanted to get some measurements." Measurements. They were measuring my home. My sanctuary, the place where I'd planned to spend whatever years I had left, surrounded by memories and the ghost of my husband's love. I followed them through my own house like a guest, watching Crystal take pictures with her phone while Marcus wrote down numbers in a notebook. Room dimensions, window sizes, the age of the appliances. They were cataloging everything, creating some kind of inventory for a future that didn't include my consent. "The master bedroom is actually pretty spacious," Crystal said, standing in the room where Robert and I had shared decades of intimate conversations, where I'd nursed sick children back to health, where I still kept my husband's reading glasses on his nightstand because moving them felt like erasing him completely. "Mom's been saying she might want something smaller anyway," Marcus lied smoothly. "Haven't you, Mom?" They both looked at me then, waiting for my response. Crystal with polite expectation, Marcus with a challenge in his eyes that warned me to agree. And I found myself nodding, betraying my own truth because the alternative, standing up to my son in front of his girlfriend, felt more frightening than this slow surrender of my autonomy. "Yes," I heard myself say, "something smaller might be easier." The word tasted like poison in my mouth, but Crystal clapped her hands together like I'd just announced wonderful news. "See? I told you she'd be practical about it," she said to Marcus. "Older people usually are, once they really think it through. Older people, as if I were a category rather than a person, as if reaching 73 had somehow disqualified me from having opinions about my own life. After they left, I sat in my living room and tried to remember when I'd stopped being Evelyn Morrison, wife, mother, individual human being with thoughts and feelings and rights, and became just mom to Marcus and older people to everyone else. When had my voice become so quiet that even I couldn't hear it anymore? The phone call that night was different. Marcus sounded excited, energetic in a way that made my stomach clench with dread. "Are you alone, Mom?" "Yes." "Good. Listen, Crystal and I were talking, and we think we found the perfect place for you. It's a really nice senior community about 20 minutes from here. Independent living, but with support services if you need them. They even have a waiting list, but Crystal knows someone who works there." Of course she did. Crystal seemed to know someone everywhere. People who could fast-track my displacement. People who could help Marcus get what he wanted faster. "I haven't said I want to move," I said quietly, but Marcus steamrolled over my objection. "Mom, we both know this house is getting to be too much for you. And honestly, it's not safe. What if you fell? What if you had a medical emergency? No one would know for hours." The same arguments, over and over. wearing me down like waves against a cliff. But now I understood that they weren't really about my safety or well-being. They were about clearing the path for Marcus and Crystal's future, a future that required my absence. I set up an appointment for you to tour the place this Friday, he continued. Crystal's going to pick you up at 10. An appointment I hadn't requested, a tour I didn't want, with a woman who saw me as an obstacle to be managed. But Marcus announced it like it was already decided, like my participation was optional, but my compliance was assumed. I started, but he cut me off. Mom, this is happening whether you like it or not. You can either be part of the solution, or you can make it harder on everyone. But Crystal and I are trying to help you here, and the least you can do is look at your options, whether I liked it or not. The words hung in the air after he hung up, echoing in my empty house like a death sentence. My opinion didn't matter. My feelings were irrelevant. My wishes were just obstacles to be overcome or ignored. Friday came too soon. Crystal arrived precisely at 10, dressed like she was going to a business meeting rather than helping an elderly woman tour a nursing home. She drove a car that cost more than I'd ever spent on anything except this house, and she talked the entire 20-minute drive about how lucky I was to have such a caring son. Marcus just wants what's best for you, she said, glancing at me in the rearview mirror like I was a child being taken to the doctor. He loses sleep worrying about you in that big house all alone. It's really sweet how much he cares. Sweet. She called his manipulation sweet. His lies about my condition, his theft of my money, his systematic destruction of my peace of mind. All of it was just evidence of how much he cared. The senior community turned out to be exactly what I'd expected. A place where people went to wait for death in small, sterile apartments that all looked exactly the same. The director, a woman named Patricia who wore too much makeup and spoke in the condescending tone people use with children and the elderly, showed us around like she was conducting a tour of paradise. We have activities every day, she said, gesturing to a room where elderly residents sat in wheelchairs staring at a television. Bingo on Mondays, crafts on Tuesdays, music therapy on Wednesdays. Music therapy. As if listening to someone play piano badly could heal the wound of being exiled from your own life. And meals are included, of course. 3 nutritious meals a day, plus snacks. No more worrying about grocery shopping or cooking. No more choosing what I wanted to eat, or when I wanted to eat it. No more growing herbs in my garden, or making Robert's favorite soup on cold days. No more independence disguised as convenience. The apartments are designed for safety and comfort, Patricia continued, opening the door to a small unit that felt more like a hotel room than a home. Easy-to-clean surfaces, grab bars in the bathroom, emergency call buttons in every room. The apartment was clean, efficient, and completely soulless. Beige walls, beige carpet, beige furniture that looked like it had been chosen by committee to offend no one and inspire nothing. A kitchenette with a microwave and mini-fridge, as if the ability to cook real meals was too dangerous for people my age. A single window that looked out onto the parking lot, where visitors could park temporarily before returning to their real lives. "What do you think, Mrs. Morrison?" Patricia asked with professional enthusiasm. "Isn't this perfect for someone in your situation?" My situation. Being old, being alone, being unwanted by the only family I had left, being pushed out of my own life by people who claimed to love me. "It's very nice," I lied, because I'd learned that honesty only led to lectures about my attitude or my resistance to change. Because Crystal was standing there watching me, ready to report back to Marcus about how unreasonable I was being. Because somewhere along the way, I'd forgotten that I had the right to say no. The application for the senior community appeared on my kitchen table 3 days later. I hadn't put it there. Marcus had let himself in while I was at the grocery store, the one place I still felt normal, still felt like a person making choices about her own life, even if those choices were limited to which brand of soup I could afford. The forms were already partially filled out. My name, my address, my date of birth, all written in Marcus's careful handwriting, as if I were incapable of writing my own name. As if my signature on documents about my own future was just a formality he could handle for me. At the bottom of the first page, there was a yellow sticky note in Crystal's bubbly script. "Just need your signature, Mrs. Morrison. So excited for your new adventure." An adventure. Moving from the home where I'd spent most of my adult life, leaving behind every memory of my husband, abandoning the garden we'd planted together, All of it was just an adventure to her. Like I was going on vacation instead of being exiled from everything that made me feel human. I sat at my kitchen table for hours, staring at those forms. The pen felt impossibly heavy in my hand. My signature, the last piece they needed to complete my removal, felt like signing my own death warrant. Not a physical death, but the death of Evelyn Morrison as an independent person who made her own decisions. That night, the phone didn't ring at 10:03. For the first time in months, Marcus didn't call to ask if I was alone. Instead, he showed up at my door at 10:05, wet from the rain that had been falling all evening, with an urgency in his eyes that made my blood run cold. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, pushing past me into my living room without being invited. "Have you signed the papers yet?" I was thinking about it," I said, but that wasn't true. I'd been staring at them, paralyzed by the weight of what they represented, unable to sign but equally unable to throw them away because I was too tired to fight anymore. "Thinking about it?" His voice had an edge I'd never heard before. "Mom, the apartment won't wait forever. There are other people who want that spot. You need to decide." But we both knew the decision had already been made for me. Marcus wasn't asking for my choice. He was demanding my cooperation with his plan. "I don't want to leave my house," I said quietly, the words barely a whisper, but somehow the loudest thing I'd said in months. Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Mom, look around. Really look. The wallpaper is peeling. The roof leaks. The furnace is older than I am. This place is falling apart, just like—" He stopped himself, but I knew what he was going to say. "Just like me. Just like his mother, who was too old and too broken to deserve a choice about where she spent her final years." "Just like what, Marcus?" I asked, finding a spark of something I thought had died completely. "Just like everything else from your generation," he said, recovering quickly. "Houses built in the 70s weren't meant to last forever, and you can't maintain it anymore. Look at you. You can barely keep up with the yard work." It was true that the yard wasn't as pristine as it had been when Robert was alive. The roses needed pruning, and the lawn had brown patches where I couldn't manage to drag the heavy hose. But it was still my yard, still the place where I'd taught my children to plant seeds, and where Robert had proposed on a spring evening 46 years ago. "I can hire someone to help with the yard," I said. But even as I spoke, I knew how pathetic I sounded. Hire someone with what money? The money Marcus had stolen? The Social Security check that barely covered my utilities and groceries? "With what, Mom? You're living paycheck to paycheck. You can't afford maintenance on this place, and it's only going to get worse." He gestured around my living room like it was evidence of my failure. "When was the last time you painted? When was the last time you replaced anything? This furniture is older than crystal." Everything was older than crystal. That seemed to be the standard by which my entire life was now measured. My furniture, my clothes, my opinions, my right to make my own decisions, all of it was outdated, obsolete, ready for disposal. "Besides," Marcus continued, settling into Robert's chair without being invited, "you're not safe here. What if you fell and broke your hip? What if you had a stroke? No one would find you for days." The same arguments, recycled endlessly. But this time, there was something different in his tone. Something that made me look at him more carefully. His clothes were expensive, more expensive than they should have been for someone who claimed to be struggling financially. His watch was new, silver and sleek. His shoes were leather, the kind that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Where was he getting money for these things? The $8,000 he'd stolen wouldn't last long with his spending habits. Unless— "Marcus," I said slowly, "how long have you been planning this?" "Planning what?" "Moving me out, selling my house." The words felt foreign in my mouth, like speaking a language I'd never learned. He was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence, I saw the truth written across his face. This wasn't a recent decision born out of concern for my welfare. This had been his plan for months, maybe years. The phone calls asking if I was alone weren't about checking on me. They were about making sure I didn't have witnesses. The visits weren't about family connection. They were reconnaissance missions, gathering information about my mental state, my financial situation, my vulnerability. "It doesn't matter how long," he said finally. "What matters is that it's the right thing to do. For everyone. For everyone." Meaning for him and Crystal, who were probably already planning how to spend the money from selling my house, who had already decided what my future would look like without bothering to ask what I wanted. That night, After Marcus left with the unsigned papers and a promise to return the next day for my signature, I did something I hadn't done since Robert's funeral. I cried. Not the quiet, dignified tears of grief, but the broken, gasping sobs of someone whose spirit had been systematically destroyed by the people who were supposed to love her most. I cried for the woman I used to be, who had opinions and dreams, and the courage to voice them. I cried for the mother who had sacrificed everything for her children, only to discover that love didn't protect you from betrayal. I cried for the wife who had lost not just her husband, but the protection his presence had provided against those who would exploit her vulnerability. But mostly, I cried because I was starting to believe that maybe Marcus was right. Maybe I was too old, too weak, too much trouble to deserve the life I wanted. Maybe fighting for my home was just selfish stubbornness. Maybe signing those papers was the kindest thing I could do for everyone, including myself. The house felt different that night. Every creak of the settling wood sounded like goodbye. Every familiar shadow looked like a memory I was about to lose. I walked through rooms that had sheltered decades of my life, touching walls that had witnessed my children's first steps, my husband's last words, my transformation from young bride to elderly widow. In the bedroom, I opened Robert's nightstand drawer, the one I'd left untouched since his death, as if disturbing his reading glasses and antacid tablets might somehow disturb his rest. Inside, beneath the usual items, I found something I'd forgotten, a letter he'd written me on our 20th anniversary. "My dearest Evelyn," it began in his careful script, "you are stronger than you know, braver than you feel, and more loved than you could ever imagine. If anything ever happens to me, promise me you won't let anyone convince you that you're anything less than extraordinary." I held that letter against my chest and tried to remember what it felt like to be extraordinary, to be strong, to be brave. The words felt like messages from another life, another woman who had existed before fear and loneliness and manipulation had worn her down to almost nothing. But even as I held Robert's words, I could feel myself slipping away. The woman he had loved and believed in was disappearing, replaced by someone who was too tired to fight, too scared to stand up for herself, too broken to believe she deserved better. Tomorrow, Marcus would return for my signature. Tomorrow, I would probably give it to him, because the alternative, continuing to fight for a life that felt increasingly impossible to maintain, required energy I no longer possessed. I fell asleep in Robert's chair, still holding his letter, dreaming of the woman I used to be, and wondering if she was gone forever. In my dreams, I was strong enough to tell Marcus no. In my dreams, I still had the power to choose my own life. But when I woke at dawn, the forms were still on my kitchen table, waiting for the signature that would end everything I had left. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I couldn't think of a single reason not to sign them, except for one small voice in the back of my mind that whispered, "You are stronger than you know." But that voice was getting harder and harder to hear. The morning light streaming through my bedroom window looked different somehow, sharper, more real. I'd been living in a fog for months, moving through my days like a ghost haunting my own life, but something about reading Robert's letter had cleared the air around me. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in his drawer, but not before reading it one more time. "You are stronger than you know, braver than you feel." The words settled into my chest like seeds that had been waiting for the right moment to grow. For the first time in weeks, I made myself a proper breakfast, not just toast or instant oatmeal, but scrambled eggs with cheese, the way Robert used to make them on Sunday mornings. I used the good china, the plates we'd saved for special occasions that never seemed special enough. If eating breakfast in my own kitchen wasn't worth celebrating with my best dishes, what was? As I ate, I really looked at my house for the first time in months. Not through Marcus's critical eyes, cataloging everything that needed repair or updating, but through my own eyes, seeing what I'd built here. The kitchen windowsill, where I'd rooted cuttings from my mother's violets, now flourishing in small pots that caught the morning sun. The living room walls lined with bookshelves Robert had built himself, each shelf holding stories that had carried me through difficult times. The hardwood floors we'd refinished together during our 3rd year of marriage, working evenings and weekends because we couldn't afford to hire professionals. This house wasn't falling apart. It was lived in. There's a difference, though I'd let Marcus convince me otherwise. I walked through each room slowly, deliberately, like I was reintroducing myself to a friend I'd neglected. In the spare bedroom that had once been Sarah's, I found the hope chest my grandmother had given me when I got married. Inside, beneath layers of tissue paper and lavender sachets, were things I'd forgotten I owned. My wedding dress, still white but yellowed at the edges. Baby clothes from when my children were small, impossibly tiny now that I couldn't imagine full-grown adults ever being that small. And at the bottom, wrapped in my grandmother's silk scarf, was something that made my breath catch in my throat. Robert's service revolver from his brief time as a security guard before he found work at the factory. I'd forgotten he'd kept it, forgotten it was even in the house. It was unloaded. Robert had been careful about such things, but it was clean and well-maintained, wrapped with a box of ammunition and a note in his handwriting. "For emergencies only, Evie. Hope you never need it." I held the gun in my hands, surprised by its weight, by how solid and real it felt. I'd never fired it, had never wanted to, but Robert had insisted I learn basic gun safety when he worked late shifts and I was alone in the house with small children. "Knowledge is protection," he'd said. "Even if you never use it, knowing you could makes a difference." I rewrapped the gun carefully and placed it back in the chest, but the knowledge of its existence had changed something fundamental in my thinking. I wasn't completely powerless. I wasn't entirely defenseless. I had options I'd forgotten about. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in months. I called Sarah, my daughter, who lived 3 states away with her successful career and her busy life that didn't have much room for an elderly mother's problems. The phone rang 4 times before she answered, and I could hear the distraction in her voice. "Hi, Mom. Is everything okay? I'm actually in the middle of a meeting, so..." "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to really listen." Something in my tone must have gotten her attention because the background noise on her end disappeared, like she'd stepped into another room. "What's wrong? Has Marcus talked to you about me? About my living situation?" There was a pause that told me everything I needed to know. "He mentioned that you might be interested in looking at some senior communities," Sarah said carefully. "He seemed to think you were having trouble maintaining the house." "Did he tell you he stole $8,000 from my savings account?" The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. "Mom, that's a serious accusation. Are you sure you're not confused about..." "I'm not confused, Sarah. I watched him write himself a check. I have the bank statements. He took the money from your father's life insurance, and now he's trying to force me out of my house so he can sell it. I don't understand. Why didn't you call the police? Why hadn't I? Because he was my son. Because I'd been taught that family problems stayed within the family. Because I'd been so worn down by his manipulation that I'd started to believe I deserved it. I don't know," I said honestly, "but I'm telling you now because I think he's planning something worse. He brings his girlfriend here to measure rooms. They've filled out applications for assisted living without asking me. And Sarah, the way he looks at me now, it's like he's waiting for me to die." I heard my daughter take a shaky breath. "Mom, if this is true, if even half of this is true, you need to protect yourself. Document everything. And maybe you should consider staying with me for a while." The offer was genuine. I could hear it in her voice, but we both knew it wasn't practical. Sarah had her own life, her own family, her own obligations. And besides, running away wouldn't solve the problem. It would just postpone it until Marcus found another way to get what he wanted. "I'm not leaving my house, Sarah. This is where your father and I built our life together. This is where I'm going to finish mine, on my own terms." After I hung up, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Clarity. The fog of confusion and self-doubt that Marcus had been deliberately cultivating was lifting, and underneath it, I found something that felt familiar, but stronger than before. Not the young woman who had been unsure of herself and eager to please, but the older woman who had survived decades of challenges and had earned the right to make her own decisions. I spent the rest of the afternoon going through my important papers, organizing them in a way that would make sense to someone else if something happened to me. But I wasn't planning to die. I was planning to live, and living required preparation. I found my will, written years ago when Robert was still alive. Everything was left to my children equally, which seemed fair at the time but felt naive now. I made a note to call a lawyer about changing it. Marcus had already taken his inheritance early. He wouldn't get the chance to take the rest. In the back of Robert's desk drawer, I found something else I'd forgotten. A small recording device he'd used for work notes. back when his memory started to fade and he needed help remembering important details. It was old but functional, and after I figured out how to work it, I tested it by recording myself reading from one of my recipe cards. My voice came back clear and distinct. That night, for the first time in months, I didn't sit by the phone waiting for Marcus to call. Instead, I made myself tea and sat in Robert's chair with a notebook, writing down everything I could remember about Marcus's visits, his threats, his theft, his manipulation, times, dates, witnesses when there were any, Crystal's measurements, the pre-filled application forms, the lies he'd told Sarah about my condition. The pattern that emerged on paper was ugly but clear. Systematic abuse of an elderly person by someone in a position of trust. Written down, documented, it looked like what it was. Not family dynamics or generational differences, but financial and emotional abuse that would be recognized as criminal by anyone who saw it objectively. At 10:03, the phone rang. I let it ring 3 times before answering, using those seconds to compose myself, to remember that I was no longer the broken woman who had been answering these calls for months. "Are you alone, Mom?" The question that had terrified me for so long now sounded different to my ears. Not a check on my welfare, but a predator making sure his prey was isolated. Not concern, but calculation. "Yes," I said, but this time the word didn't feel like surrender. It felt like bait. "Good. I'll be over tomorrow morning to get those papers. I assume you've signed them by now." He assumed. Of course he did. He'd worn me down so systematically, so thoroughly, that he couldn't imagine I might fight back. "We'll see," I said. And for the first time in our recent conversations, I was the one who hung up first. I spent the rest of the evening reading Robert's letter again, but this time the words didn't make me cry. They made me angry. Not the helpless anger of someone who felt powerless, but the focused anger of someone who had been pushed too far by people who mistook kindness for weakness. I was stronger than I knew. I was braver than I felt. And tomorrow, when Marcus came for my signature, he was going to discover that the broken woman he'd been systematically destroying had remembered how to fight back. The recording device sat on my kitchen table, ready. The documentation was organized and clear. And somewhere in the back of my mind, Robert's voice was steady and sure. "Knowledge is protection, Evie. Even if you never use it, knowing you could makes a difference." But I was planning to use it, all of it, because I'd realized something important during my day of clarity. Marcus hadn't been asking if I was alone out of concern for my safety. He'd been asking because he was planning something that required me to be isolated and defenseless. Well, I was alone, but I wasn't defenseless anymore. And tomorrow, he was going to find that out. I woke before dawn, which was unusual for me these days. For months, sleep had been my only escape from Marcus's psychological torture, but this morning felt different. I wasn't hiding from the day ahead. I was preparing for it. I made coffee in Robert's favorite mug, the one with the chip on the handle that he'd refused to let me throw away. "It still holds coffee just fine," he used to say. "A little damage doesn't make something worthless." I understood now why that memory felt so important today. By 7 a.m., I had everything arranged exactly as I wanted it. The recording device was tucked into the pocket of my cardigan, tested and ready. The documentation I'd organized the night before sat in a neat stack on Robert's desk, each piece of evidence clearly labeled with dates and descriptions. The application forms Marcus expected me to sign remained on the kitchen table, but I'd made some additions he wouldn't expect. I'd written my own note in the margins, in the same careful handwriting my mother had taught me 70 years ago. "Completed under duress. Applicant has been threatened with homelessness and subjected to financial theft by family member Marcus Morrison. Signature obtained through coercion, not consent. Let him try to use those forms now." The gun remained in the hope chest, wrapped in my grandmother's scarf. I didn't plan to use it. Violence wasn't who I was, even after everything Marcus had done. But knowing it was there, knowing I had that final option if things went horribly wrong, gave me a confidence I hadn't felt in months. At 8:30, I called my bank. Getting through to a human being took 20 minutes of automated menus and hold music, but finally, I reached a supervisor named Janet, who listened carefully as I explained my situation. "Mrs. Morrison, I want to make sure I understand correctly," Janet said after I'd finished. "You're saying that someone with access to your joint account withdrew $8,000 without your knowledge or consent?" "That's correct. My son forged my signature on a check made out to himself. And you have documentation of this? I looked at the bank statement spread across my kitchen table. Yes, I have the canceled check with the forged signature, and I can prove it's not my handwriting. Mrs. Morrison, what you're describing is bank fraud and financial elder abuse. These are serious criminal charges. Are you prepared to file a formal complaint? For months, that question would have paralyzed me. Family loyalty, fear of consequences, the horror of sending my own son to jail, all of it would have made me hang up and pretend this conversation never happened. But this morning, sitting in my kitchen surrounded by evidence of systematic abuse, with Robert's letter fresh in my memory and my grandmother's strength flowing through my veins, the answer came easily. Yes, I am. Janet walked me through the process. Forms to fill out, statements to sign, evidence to submit. She also mentioned something that made my blood run cold. This type of financial abuse was rarely an isolated incident. In cases like this, Mrs. Morrison, the perpetrator usually escalates. Once they've taken what they can access easily, they often try to gain legal control over the victim's remaining assets. Has anyone pressured you to sign power of attorney documents or change your will? I thought about the application forms on my table, about Marcus's increasing urgency, about Crystal measuring my rooms like she was already planning the renovation. Not yet, I said, but I think that's coming. I strongly recommend you contact Adult Protective Services as well. They can help you create a safety plan and connect you with legal resources. And Mrs. Morrison, document everything from now on. Dates, times, witnesses, exactly what was said. If this escalates, you'll need evidence. After I hung up with the bank, I called APS. The intake worker, a young man named David who spoke with professional kindness, scheduled a home visit for the following week. But when I described Marcus's pattern of showing up unannounced and his escalating threats, David's tone became more urgent. Mrs. Morrison, do you feel safe in your home right now? The question should have been simple, but it made me pause. Did I feel safe? With Marcus having a key, knowing he could appear at any moment, increasingly desperate as his plans met unexpected resistance. I'm not sure, I admitted. Would you like us to expedite the safety assessment? I could have someone out there this afternoon. Let me think about it. I'll call you back. I spent the next hour walking through my house, seeing it through new eyes. The back door that stuck and required a hard pull to open properly. Marcus knew about that. The spare key hidden under the flower pot by the garage. He'd seen me use it countless times. The fact that my bedroom was on the ground floor, easily accessible through the window that didn't lock properly because the mechanism had been broken for years. All these little vulnerabilities that came with living in an older house, that I'd accepted as minor inconveniences, suddenly felt like gaping security holes. How had I been so naive? How had I lived here for months, knowing Marcus was growing more desperate and unstable without taking basic precautions for my own safety? I called a locksmith. The earliest they could come was next week, but I scheduled the appointment anyway. New locks, security chains, window locks that actually worked. It would cost money I could barely spare, but what was the point of protecting my finances if I wasn't around to use them? Next, I called Mrs. Patterson, my neighbor who'd lived next door for 15 years. Eleanor was 80 herself, but sharp as a tack and protective of the elderly women in our neighborhood. She'd seen Marcus coming and going at odd hours, had probably noticed the tension in my voice when I spoke about him. Eleanor, I need to ask you a favor, I said when she answered. If you see my son Marcus at my house tonight or tomorrow, especially if it seems like there's some kind of disturbance, would you call the police? There was a pause. Evelyn, honey, is everything all right? I've been worried about you lately. You seem different. She meant broken, frightened, diminished. The way abuse victims always look to observant neighbors who cared enough to notice. I'm going to be fine, I said, and for the first time in months, I believed it. But I need to handle some family business, and I might need a witness to make sure it stays civil. Of course, dear. And Evelyn, if you need somewhere to stay tonight, you're always welcome here. The offer touched me more than I could express. After months of feeling completely isolated, discovering that I had allies, even neighbors I'd barely spoken to beyond pleasantries, felt like finding water in a desert. By afternoon, I had everything in place. The bank fraud complaint was filed. Adult Protective Services was aware of my situation. My neighbor was on alert. My documentation was organized and ready. The recording device was charged and tested. Most importantly, I had changed the message on my answering machine. Instead of my usual greeting, anyone who called would now hear, "You've reached Evelyn Morrison. I'm unable to come to the phone right now, but your call is very important to me. Please leave a detailed message, including the date and time of your call, and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. Remember, this call may be recorded for quality assurance purposes." It was a small thing, but it served notice that Evelyn Morrison was no longer the confused, isolated old woman who could be manipulated without consequences. I was someone who documented things, who had procedures, who treated every interaction as potentially significant. At 4 o'clock, I made myself a proper lunch and sat down to eat it at my kitchen table. The same table where I'd sat paralyzed with fear just days earlier. The same table where Marcus had announced his intention to take over my life. But the woman sitting there now was fundamentally different from the one who had been there before. I wasn't just eating lunch. I was claiming space, asserting my right to exist in my own home, preparing my body and mind for the confrontation that was coming. Because Marcus would be here soon. He'd made that clear last night. He was coming for my signature on those forms, and he expected to get it. He'd been so confident in his psychological manipulation, so certain that months of systematic abuse had broken my will completely, that he probably hadn't even considered the possibility of resistance. That was his mistake. At 6:30, I took Robert's recording device from my pocket and spoke into it clearly and calmly. "This is Evelyn Morrison, recording on Thursday evening. I am 73 years old, and I am of sound mind and body. I am making this recording because I have reason to believe my son Marcus Morrison may attempt to coerce me into signing legal documents or may escalate his pattern of financial and emotional abuse. Any agreements I make under duress should be considered invalid. If something happens to me, this recording should be given to Adult Protective Services and the police." I rewound it and played it back. My voice was steady, clear, competent, the voice of someone who knew exactly what was happening and had made careful preparations to protect herself. Then I put the device back in my pocket and waited. Marcus would come tonight. I was certain of it. His impatience yesterday, his assumption that I would simply comply, his need to close this deal quickly before I could change my mind or seek help, all of it pointed to immediate action. And when he came, he would discover that the helpless old woman he'd been terrorizing had remembered something important. She was Robert Morrison's wife, Eleanor Patterson's neighbor, Sarah's mother, and a woman who had survived 73 years by being stronger than anyone expected. The sun was setting outside my kitchen window, painting my familiar walls in shades of gold and amber. Soon it would be dark, and Marcus would come believing he was visiting a victim. Instead, he would find a woman ready to fight for her life. The rain started at 9:15, drumming against my windows with increasing intensity. I sat in my living room with all the lights on, making sure anyone approaching the house would know I was awake and alert. The recording device in my pocket felt warm against my ribs, ready to capture whatever was about to unfold. At exactly 10:03, my phone rang. I let it ring twice before answering. "Are you alone, Mom?" But this time, instead of the familiar chill of fear, I felt something else entirely. Clarity, purpose, the calm that comes when you finally understand the game that's been played against you. "Yes, Marcus. I'm alone." "Good. I'm coming over to get those papers. Have them ready." He hung up without waiting for my response, but I was already moving. I pressed record on the device in my pocket and spoke clearly. "Marcus Morrison just called to inform me he's coming to my house to obtain signed documents. The time is 10:05 p.m. on Thursday. I am recording this interaction for my protection." 15 minutes later, I heard his car in my driveway. The engine shut off, and I listened to his footsteps on my front walkway, hurried, confident steps of someone who expected no resistance. He didn't knock. He used his key. The sound of my own front door opening without my permission sent a surge of adrenaline through my system. This was my home, my sanctuary, and he was entering it like he already owned it, like my consent was irrelevant to his plans. "Mom?" he called out. But there was something different in his voice. Urgency. Desperation, maybe. "Where are the papers?" I stood up from Robert's chair and walked into the foyer, where Marcus was shaking rain from his jacket. He looked different, thinner than I remembered, with dark circles under his eyes, and a nervous energy that made him seem almost manic. "Hello, Marcus," I said calmly. "You're dripping on my floor." He looked at me strangely. as if my tone wasn't what he'd expected. For months, our interactions had followed the same pattern. He would demand, I would comply. He would threaten, I would surrender. But tonight, I was simply observing, recording, gathering evidence. The papers, Mom. Did you sign them? I looked at them, I said, which was true. They're on the kitchen table. He pushed past me toward the kitchen, and I followed at a measured pace. No hurry, no anxiety, just a woman in her own home, watching a disturbed individual reveal his true nature. When he saw the forms on the table, he froze. I'd left them exactly where he'd expect them, but my additions were clearly visible. The notes about coercion, the statements about duress, the careful documentation of his financial abuse. "What the hell is this?" he said, his voice rising. "What did you write on these?" "The truth," I said simply. "That these forms were completed under threat, that you've been stealing from me, and that any signature obtained through intimidation should be considered invalid." His face went through several emotions in rapid succession: confusion, anger, and finally something that looked like panic. This wasn't going according to his script. The broken old woman he'd been systematically destroying was supposed to meekly sign whatever he put in front of her. "Mom, you can't. You don't understand the situation. You need to sign these papers clean, without all this nonsense written on them." "Why?" I asked, my voice steady. "What happens if I don't?" And that's when Marcus dropped the pretense entirely. The concerned son disappeared, replaced by someone I barely recognized, cold, calculating, and desperate. "Because you don't have a choice," he said, his voice low and threatening. "Look around, Mom. Look at yourself. You're 73 years old, living alone in a house you can't maintain, with barely enough money to survive. You think you can fight me? You think anyone would believe you over me?" I felt the recording device capturing every word, every threat, every admission that this had never been about my welfare. "I think you'd be surprised what people would believe," I said quietly. "No one cares about you." The words exploded out of him with a viciousness that made me step back. "Sarah's too busy with her own life to worry about an aging mother who's becoming more trouble than she's worth. Your neighbors barely know you exist. You have no friends, no support system, no one who would even notice if you disappeared tomorrow." Each word was designed to wound, to remind me of my isolation and vulnerability. But instead of crushing me the way they would have weeks ago, they revealed something important. Marcus was more desperate than I'd realized. People who felt secure in their position didn't resort to this level of cruelty. "So here's what's going to happen," he continued, his voice getting colder with each sentence. "You're going to sign these papers properly. Clean signatures, no additional notes, no attempts to document anything. You're going to move into that assisted living place, and you're going to be grateful that I'm handling all the difficult decisions for you. And if I refuse?" Marcus smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You won't refuse, because if you do, I'll have you declared incompetent. I'll tell them you're having memory problems, that you're paranoid and delusional, that you're no longer capable of making rational decisions about your own welfare." He pulled out his phone and showed me something that made my blood run cold. Photos. Pictures of my house taken during his uninvited visits, showing the peeling wallpaper, the stained carpet, the broken window latch. Pictures of me looking confused and distressed, probably taken during his worst verbal assaults when I was at my most vulnerable. "I've been documenting your decline for months," he said with satisfaction. "I have pictures of the house deteriorating, recordings of our conversations where you sound confused and disoriented, even medical records showing your increased anxiety and depression. Any court would agree that you need someone to make decisions for you." But as he spoke, I realized something that almost made me smile. Marcus thought he was the only one who'd been gathering evidence. He thought documentation was a weapon that only he could wield. "You recorded our conversations?" I asked. "Some of them. The ones where you sounded the most confused, the most unable to handle basic decisions. Really, Mom, I was doing you a favor, building a case for why you need help." "That's interesting," I said, reaching into my pocket, "because I've been recording our conversations too." I pulled out Robert's device and set it on the kitchen table between us. Marcus stared at it like it was a snake. "Everything you just said is on here," I continued, my voice steady and clear. "Your threats, your admission that you've been deliberately documenting me at my worst moments, your plan to have me declared incompetent, all of it." The color drained from Marcus's face. "You can't. That's illegal. You can't record someone without their consent. Actually, in this state I can. One-party consent law. As long as one person in the conversation knows it's being recorded, it's perfectly legal. I looked it up. For the first time since this nightmare began, I saw fear in my son's eyes. Real fear. The kind that comes when someone realizes their carefully laid plans are falling apart. But more importantly, I continued, I've already filed complaints with the bank about the money you stole and with Adult Protective Services about your pattern of abuse. They're aware of your attempts to force me from my home, and they have copies of all my documentation. Marcus stood very still for a long moment, processing this information. Then, without warning, he lunged forward and grabbed for the recording device. But I was ready for him. I'd been preparing for this moment all day, and I snatched the device away before he could reach it. That's evidence tampering, I said calmly. Another crime to add to the list. You don't understand what you're doing, Marcus said, his voice rising to a near shout. You're ruining everything. That money you're crying about, I needed it. And this house is wasted on you. You're going to die soon anyway, and then what? It'll just sit here empty while it could be helping people who actually have a future. People like you and Crystal? Yes. People who can actually do something with it instead of just existing. The word hung in the air between us like a physical blow. Existing. That's all I was to him. An obstacle that existed in the way of his plans, consuming resources he felt belonged to him. But instead of breaking me, his words crystallized something that had been building all evening. I wasn't just existing. I was living, thinking, planning, fighting back. I was everything he'd tried to convince me I wasn't. Get out, I said quietly. What? Get out of my house. Right now. You're not welcome here anymore. Marcus laughed, but it sounded forced. You can't throw me out. This is still legally your house for now, but you can't. Yes, I can. It's called trespassing, and I'm asking you to leave. If you refuse, I'll call the police and have you removed. I moved toward the kitchen phone, but Marcus stepped between me and the wall. You're not calling anyone, he said, and for the first time, I heard real menace in his voice. We're going to finish this conversation, and you're going to sign those papers, and then we're going to pretend this little rebellion never happened. But I was no longer afraid, because I realized that Marcus had made the same mistake every bully makes. He'd assumed that his victim would stay broken forever. He'd never planned for the possibility that I might remember who I used to be. Step away from the phone, Marcus, I said firmly. Or what? And that's when I told him about the gun. Or I'll defend myself, I said simply. Your father kept a gun in this house, Marcus. I know where it is. I know how to use it. And I know that any 73-year-old woman who shoots an intruder in her own home at 10:30 at night will be considered a victim, not a criminal. The change in Marcus was immediate and dramatic. The aggressive posture deflated, the threatening stance softened, and suddenly he looked like what he really was, a middle-aged man who'd been caught trying to abuse an elderly woman and was running out of options. Mom, you don't mean that. You wouldn't actually, wouldn't I asked. And something in my voice must have convinced him that I absolutely would. A few months ago, you would have been right. The woman you've been terrorizing wouldn't have fought back. But that woman is gone, Marcus. You destroyed her so thoroughly that someone stronger had to take her place. I could see him calculating, trying to figure out how to regain control of a situation that had spiraled completely beyond his expectations. His eyes darted around my kitchen, looking for advantages, for weapons, for something that would give him back the power he'd lost. You're bluffing, he said, but there was no confidence in his voice. Am I? You've spent months convincing me that I'm weak, isolated, and helpless. But you know what? You were wrong about all three. I'm not weak. I survived losing the love of my life, and I'm still here. I'm not isolated. I have neighbors who care about me and children who love me, even if one of them forgot how to show it, and I'm certainly not helpless. I walked to the kitchen drawer and pulled out my cell phone, keeping my eyes on Marcus the entire time. Right now, I'm going to call the police. I'm going to tell them that my son broke into my house, threatened me, attempted to force me to sign legal documents under duress, and refused to leave when asked. I have recordings of his threats, documentation of his theft, and a witness next door who's been watching for exactly this situation. Marcus's face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, anger, and finally, something that looked almost like respect. You really did plan this whole thing, he said. I planned to protect myself, I corrected. I plan to stop being a victim. I plan to remember that I'm a human being with rights, not a resource for you to exploit. I started dialing 911, but Marcus held up his hand. Wait, he said. Just wait. Let me think. There's nothing to think about, Marcus. You stole from me. You threatened me. You tried to force me from my home. These aren't complicated moral questions. They're crimes. I know, he said quietly, and for the first time in months, he sounded like the son I used to know. I know what I did. I know what I became. I paused with my finger over the call button. Something in his voice was different. Not the manipulation I'd learned to recognize, but what sounded like genuine remorse. Then why? I asked. Why would you do this to me? I loved you, Marcus. I gave you everything I had, and it still wasn't enough? He sat down heavily in one of my kitchen chairs, looking older than his 35 years. Because I was broke, he said. Because Crystal was going to leave me if I couldn't provide the lifestyle she wanted. Because I've been living above my means for years, and everything was falling apart, and I panicked. So you decided to destroy my life to save yours? I told myself it was temporary, he said, not meeting my eyes. I told myself that once I got back on my feet, I'd take care of you properly, buy you a nice place, make sure you were comfortable. I convinced myself that forcing you into assisted living was actually better for you. But you knew it wasn't true. Yeah, he whispered. I knew. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of his admission filling the space between us. Part of me, the mother part that had loved him unconditionally for 35 years, wanted to comfort him, to find a way to forgive and move forward. But the stronger part of me, the part that had been systematically brutalized for months, knew better. I'm still calling the police, I said. I know, and I'm still pressing charges. I know, and you're never setting foot in this house again. Marcus nodded, tears running down his face. I'm sorry, Mom. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I am so sorry. I studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation, for the calculated emotions he'd used against me so many times. But this felt different. This felt real. I'm sorry, too, I said finally. I'm sorry I raised a son who thought it was acceptable to abuse his mother. I'm sorry I enabled your behavior for so long that you thought there would never be consequences. And I'm sorry that it took me 73 years to learn how to stand up for myself. I dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? This is Evelyn Morrison at 1247 Maple Street. I need to report a break-in and threats made against me by my son. He's still in my house, and I need him removed immediately. The dispatcher was professional and calm, asking for details, confirming my address, assuring me that officers were on their way. Through the window, I could see lights coming on in Eleanor's house. She was awake and watching, ready to be a witness if needed. Marcus didn't try to leave. He sat at my kitchen table with his head in his hands, occasionally looking up at me with something that might have been admiration mixed with regret. You really did it, he said. You really fought back. I really did. Dad would be proud of you. The comment hit me harder than I expected. Robert would be proud, not just of my courage in this moment, but of my decision to reclaim the strength he'd always seen in me, the strength I'd forgotten I possessed. The police arrived 12 minutes later, 2 officers who'd clearly dealt with domestic situations before. They separated us immediately, taking my statement in the living room while Marcus was questioned in the kitchen. I gave them everything: the recording device, the bank statements showing the theft, the documentation I'd prepared, the photos on my phone of the pre-filled application forms. Officer Rodriguez, a woman about Sarah's age with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner, listened to everything without judgment. Mrs. Morrison, what you're describing is textbook elder abuse, she said. Financial exploitation, emotional manipulation, coercion regarding housing decisions. We see this more often than people realize, and unfortunately, it's usually family members who are the perpetrators. What happens now? We'll arrest your son on charges of financial elder abuse, theft, breaking and entering, and making threats. The district attorney will review the case, but with the evidence you've provided, prosecution is very likely. Through the kitchen doorway, I could see Marcus being handcuffed. He didn't resist, didn't argue, didn't try to talk his way out of it. He just stood there accepting the consequences of his choices with a resignation that might have been relief. As they led him toward the front door, he stopped and looked back at me. Mom, will you ever forgive me? I thought about that for a long moment. Forgiveness was complicated when the person who'd hurt you was your own child. Love didn't disappear just because trust had been shattered. Maybe someday, I said honestly. But forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting. And it's not the same as allowing you back into my life. You made choices, Marcus. Now you have to live with them. He nodded and allowed the officers to escort him out of my house and out of my life. After everyone left, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea, listening to the familiar sounds of my house settling for the night. But the silence felt different now. Not empty or lonely, but peaceful, safe. I called Sarah and told her everything. She cried, apologized for not believing me sooner, and promised to visit the following weekend. Not to check on me or assess my competency, but to spend time with her mother, who had just proven herself to be far stronger than anyone had given her credit for. 3 weeks later, Marcus pleaded guilty to all charges. He was sentenced to 18 months in prison and ordered to pay full restitution. Crystal left him the day after his arrest, taking with her the expensive lifestyle he'd been stealing from me to provide. I used the insurance settlement to update my home security system, repair the things that actually needed fixing, and put the rest in a new account that only I could access. The house that Marcus had claimed was falling apart turned out to need remarkably little work once I had the resources to maintain it properly. But the most important change wasn't to my house or my bank account. It was to me. I learned that being alone didn't mean being powerless. I learned that family relationships could be rebuilt on healthier foundations or ended entirely if necessary. I learned that at 73, I was still capable of growing, changing, and fighting for the life I wanted. Most importantly, I learned that Robert had been right. I was stronger than I knew, braver than I felt, and more loved than I had ever imagined. 6 months after that terrible night in my kitchen, I sit at the same table where Marcus tried to steal my future, writing thank you notes to the people who helped me reclaim my life. Eleanor next door, who never hesitated to offer support. Officer Rodriguez, who treated me with dignity and respect. David from Adult Protective Services, who helped me understand my rights and options. And Sarah, who calls every Sunday now not to check on my deteriorating condition, but to hear about my plans for the week ahead. Because I have plans now. I have a life worth living, a voice worth hearing, and a future worth protecting. And if anyone ever tries to take that away from me again, they'll discover that this time, I'm ready for them.